The sun hung low over the dusty horizon, casting long, molten gold shadows across the town. The main street, usually bustling with traders and travelers, had a rare calm that morning, the silence broken only by the creak of a wagon wheel and the faint clatter of a horse's hooves. Dust swirled lazily around the wooden planks of the sidewalks, lifting with each careful step of a lone woman making her way down the street. She moved with a purposeful elegance, though the journey had taken its toll. Her fine leather boots were scuffed, her gloves smeared with streaks of dirt, and a faint crease ran across the pristine white of her dress. She was young, no more than 22, with hair the color of burnished chestnut and eyes that seemed too curious for her surroundings. Travelers had whispered tales of frontier towns like this one, lawless, unyielding, and unforgiving to anyone who didn't belong. Yet she walked through the dust-choked air as if she were stepping through the hallways of a grand estate. Her poise drew glances from the few townspeople who lingered at doors and windows, curious about the rare presence of someone so refined in such a rugged place, and then, at the corner of the street, she saw him. He stood partially in shadow, leaning casually against the post of a weathered building. His silhouette was strong, broad-shouldered, a figure carved by the wilderness itself. His skin was the color of rich, sun-warmed earth, and the sharp line of his jaw gave him a fierce, untamed beauty. Dark eyes, alert and calculating, followed her movements, absorbing every detail of her approach. He was unmistakably Apache, his presence commanding yet quiet, as if he had stepped from the desert itself and into the heart of the town. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. It was recognition, not of acquaintance, but of souls that, by some strange twist of fate, understood each other across the boundaries of culture and circumstance. She felt a thrill, sharp and disconcerting at being so openly observed, and yet she could not look away. Her pulse quickened, a mixture of fear and fascination, while the heat of the sun pressed against her skin and the dust clung stubbornly to her dress. As she drew closer, the wooden boards beneath her feet creaked, and a sudden gust of wind swirled through the street. She adjusted the edges of her dress, tightening the ribbons at her waist, but the wind had its own plans. It caught the fabric and tugged it downward, brushing the hem into the gritty dust. A gasp escaped her lips, partly from surprise and partly from embarrassment. She bent quickly to lift it, but the dress had already lost its pristine elegance, flecked now with flecks of brown. The Apache stepped forward before she could recover, moving with a grace that belied his rugged exterior. His gaze lingered on the dress, and a low, husky whisper broke the silence of the street. "Lord, have mercy." The words were soft but filled with awe, and they seemed to hang in the air between them, as heavy as the heat of the midday sun. She froze, unsure whether to feel offended or flattered. There was no lewdness in his tone, only astonishment, admiration, and perhaps a touch of reverence. For the first time, she noticed the subtleties of his appearance, the faint scar along his cheek, the way his fingers flexed with readiness, the small, careful movements that betrayed the life of vigilance he must lead. There was danger in him, yes, but there was also a quiet magnetism, a power that drew her eyes despite the dusty chaos around them. And so, amid the swirls of dirt and sun, they stood there, a woman out of place in a harsh frontier town, and an Apache man who had emerged from the wilderness like a shadow of the land itself. The world around them faded, the whispers of curious townsfolk barely registering, as if destiny itself had paused to witness this improbable meeting. The air between them thrummed with tension, anticipation, and the unspoken knowledge that their paths had crossed for a reason neither fully understood. In that moment, she could feel the story of her life beginning to shift, a turn as unpredictable as the wind that had brought her dress to the dust, and the eyes of the Apache upon her would not soon forget it. The morning had already begun to warm the dusty street, and the tension between them lingered like the stubborn haze that hovered over the town. She straightened her shoulders, trying to reclaim her composure, and tugged at the hem of her dress once more. The dirt and grit that clung to it seemed to mock her efforts. She had traveled far, endured long days on the road, and braved the wilderness outside the frontier town, all to arrive here, and now a simple gust of wind threatened to undo her dignity. The Apache remained silent, leaning casually against the post, yet his dark eyes never left her. Every subtle movement of his gaze made her heart skip, a paradox of intimidation and fascination. She felt simultaneously exposed and strangely alive under his scrutiny, as if his presence amplified every sensation around her. Even the dust seemed sharper, the sunlight harsher, the creak of the boards beneath her boots more resonant. Then it happened, a sudden, mischievous gust of wind swept through the street again, stronger this time. Her dress, already weakened at the edges, caught the wind and slipped, cascading downward until it pooled in the dust at her feet. A startled cry escaped her lips. Her cheeks flushed, a burning mix of embarrassment and indignation. She rushed forward to lift the garment, but the dust had claimed it first, staining the delicate fabric. For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. The town, momentarily still, held its breath. Her hands clutched the dress tightly, but it was no use. The humiliation had already happened, and then the whisper came again, low and gravelly, carrying across the distance between them. "Lord, have mercy." The words were not crude, not mocking. They were awe-filled, intimate in a way that made her pulse accelerate. She glanced up, her anger and embarrassment mixing with a spark of curiosity. The Apache had stepped closer without moving his feet, as if drawn by the pull of the moment, his presence solidifying around her like the weight of the desert sun. His gaze lingered, unwavering and deep, as though he were trying to see past the dirt-streaked dress and into her very soul. A flicker of defiance rose within her. She was no naive child. She had grown up in polite society. Yes, but she was capable of standing her ground. Yet despite her resolve, she felt a shiver run down her spine. There was a strange honesty in his eyes, a raw, unpolished admiration that stirred something inside her. It was both frightening and exhilarating. Is that all you have to say?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt at firmness. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Not all," he murmured, his voice low and smooth like the whisper of wind through canyon rocks. "But some things are better left unspoken." She felt a strange pull toward him, a mixture of intrigue, confusion, and desire. Every instinct told her to step back, to reclaim her dignity and retreat into the safety of her own world. Yet another part of her, a reckless, daring part, wanted to stay to see where this sudden, electrifying connection might lead. The townspeople, who had gathered in quiet curiosity, began to murmur among themselves. Their whispers were like insects buzzing in the heat, small and distracting, yet she barely noticed them. Her attention was fixed entirely on the man who had spoken those words, the Apache whose gaze both challenged and invited her. Finally, she straightened the dress as best she could and met his eyes. There was a spark there unmistakable, and a silent acknowledgement that something profound had shifted between them. A single fleeting moment, a dress falling to the dust, a whispered exclamation, had created a connection neither could ignore. In the midst of that dusty street, with the heat pressing down and the world humming softly around them, she realized that this encounter was no accident. It was the beginning of a story, one neither of them had expected, yet one that would change everything. And as she lifted her gaze to his once more, she knew, without fully understanding why, that her journey was no longer just about reaching a destination. It was about the man standing before her, the moment that had stolen her breath and the unpredictable path that lay ahead. The dust from the morning's gust still clung stubbornly to her dress, leaving streaks of brown across the pristine fabric. She brushed at it with trembling hands, but it was clear that perfection was no longer an option. The Apache's gaze followed every movement, steady and unrelenting like the desert sun that measured time in slow, deliberate strokes. She felt both self-conscious and strangely emboldened, as though the scrutiny of a man who had lived in the harshest lands had stripped away her pretense and revealed a raw version of herself she rarely allowed others to see. He spoke first, his voice low, resonant, and deliberate. "You walk as if the dust offends you," he said, a hint of curiosity threading through his tone. "But it is all around. You cannot escape it." She straightened, indignation rising despite the fluttering warmth in her chest. "I am not used to this. Frontier," she admitted, her voice carrying the faint lilt of someone raised in manners and civilization. "I was told towns like this are untamed, yes, but also dangerous." He raised an eyebrow, a wry half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Danger is everywhere," he replied. "It does not choose you because of who you are. It chooses those who do not respect it." She blinked, taken aback by the truth in his words. His life, clearly molded by survival, carried a simplicity and clarity she had never known. In her world, rules were written on paper, enforced by polite society and often broken in secret. Here rules were written in the earth, in the sun, and in the dangers of every step. A silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. It was filled with the sound of wind rattling against the wooden boards of the buildings, the distant clatter of a wagon wheel, and the soft murmur of townsfolk curious enough to peek from behind doors. Yet neither spoke immediately. The distance between them, measured in cautious glances and the space a breath might fill, became a place of understanding and intrigue. "You are not like the others," he said finally, his tone almost a whisper. "Others fear the land. You do not. You may not know it, but you are learning its lessons quickly." She felt a flush rise to her cheeks, a mixture of pride and confusion. I am merely trying to survive," she said, her voice softer now. "I do not claim to understand this place." "But you are open to it," he observed. "That is rare. Most come here and see only hardship. They do not see the beauty, the freedom." The word struck her. She had always thought of freedom as a luxury reserved for those with money or status. Yet here, in the dust-choked streets and under the unrelenting sun, he seemed to define it differently, as the ability to face life unflinchingly, to move with the land, to survive by skill, courage, and respect. She glanced at him, noting the subtle movements of his hands, the easy way he balanced on the uneven planks, the fluidity that spoke of years spent moving through untamed terrain. He was at once alien and magnetic, a living embodiment of everything she did not know but secretly longed to understand. "I do not know your ways," she said after a pause, "and I do not know if I could ever belong here." He tilted his head slightly, the wind catching a loose strand of his dark hair. "Belonging is a choice," he said simply, "and sometimes it chooses you." Her heart stirred, caught between apprehension and something deeper, something primal and compelling. The tension between them grew, an invisible thread stretching taut, binding them with curiosity, challenge, and the promise of something neither had dared to name. As the sun climbed higher, casting sharper shadows across the dusty street, she realized that the cultural gap between them was not merely one of customs or background. It was a divide of experience, perception, and heart. And yet within that gap, there was a bridge forming, fragile but undeniable, built on understanding, fascination, and the quiet acknowledgement of what they could not yet say aloud. She took a tentative step closer. He did not move away, and in that measured, silent agreement the first true connection was forged, not in words, but in the recognition that their worlds, however different, had collided in a way neither could ignore. The day had grown hotter, the sun beating down relentlessly, baking the wooden boards of the town into a harsh, unyielding surface. She had been walking beside him for only a short while, yet the sense of safety she had felt initially began to waver. The streets, once quietly observant, now seemed charged with a tension she could not explain. A shadow moved in the distance, a figure on horseback, cloaked and deliberate in its approach. Her heart tightened. She glanced at him, seeking reassurance. The Apache's posture shifted subtly, the easy grace of moments before replaced by a poised, coiled readiness. His dark eyes followed the approaching figure with a sharp, unblinking intensity. He did not speak, but she felt the weight of his awareness pressing into her chest, grounding her even as fear took root. The rider drew closer, and the threat became undeniable. A bandit, notorious in these parts, had been searching for travelers to rob and intimidate. The air seemed to thicken as the man dismounted, spurs clinking ominously against the boards, and his eyes narrowed as they fell upon her. She froze, a helpless target in the open street. "Step aside," he sneered, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. "This does not concern you, boy," he added, addressing her companion with a mocking curl of his lips. The Apache moved like a shadow, silent and swift. One hand went to his belt, where a knife gleamed briefly in the sunlight. His stance was fluid, controlled, yet brimming with an unmistakable threat. She had no doubt that he was capable of stopping this man, and she also had no doubt that she had never felt more certain that she wanted him on her side. "Do not make a mistake," he said quietly, his voice a calm contrast to the tension radiating from the bandit. The words were not loud, but the certainty behind them made her stomach tighten. The bandit laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "A man in feathers and leather thinks he can scare me?" He advanced, pistol raised, his confidence fueled by ignorance of the Apache's skill and resolve. Time seemed to slow. She clutched her dress to her chest, her breath caught in her throat, and watched as the Apache stepped forward, his movements precise, measured, and utterly lethal. In a flurry of motion that blurred with speed, he disarmed the bandit, sending the pistol skittering across the boards. The man staggered back, eyes wide with shock and fear, but the Apache did not pause. One swift, controlled motion sent the bandit sprawling to the ground, and he scrambled away, cursing under his breath, realizing he had underestimated his opponent. Her knees nearly buckled with relief. She had never seen such power, such absolute command displayed with both skill and restraint, and yet it was not the violence that held her attention. It was the quiet, unwavering control in his dark eyes, the way he had acted not out of anger, but necessity. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning toward her. The menace of moments ago replaced with concern. The softness in his voice was almost shocking after the display of raw strength. She shook her head, unable to speak, her lips parting only to release a nervous laugh that was half relief and half awe. I think not," she stammered. "But thank you." Her voice faltered under the weight of her emotions. He stepped closer, brushing a few strands of hair from her face, and she noticed for the first time the fine details of him, the scar along his cheek, the taut muscles under his shirt, the intensity of his gaze softened only slightly by his care for her. "You must be more cautious," he said. "The world out here is not kind to those who do not understand it." She nodded, still shaken, but inside her a strange thrill was growing. The danger had revealed not just his strength, but his character. He was protector, observer, and mystery all at once, a man shaped by the harshness of the land, yet capable of gentleness. And in that realization, she felt an unspoken trust beginning to form, fragile but undeniable. The sun continued to climb, shadows shortening across the dusty street, yet she no longer felt the heat as sharply. Her gaze remained fixed on him, and she knew, with a certainty that startled her, that the story of her journey was becoming inseparable from the man who had saved her. The day had turned late, and the sun, once harsh and commanding, now dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty street. The events with the bandit had left her shaken but also strangely exhilarated. Her heart still raced, and she could feel the echo of his presence in every pulse. But now a new challenge presented itself: shelter. The town was small, its buildings sparse, and the nearest inn was overcrowded, the doors nearly closed to travelers like herself. I do not know where to stay," she admitted, her voice faltering. "I cannot travel any farther tonight." He regarded her silently for a long moment, his dark eyes calculating, unreadable. Then, without a word, he gestured toward the edge of town. "Come with me," he said simply. "It is not far. There is a place you may rest." Reluctantly, she followed, her steps tentative. The streets narrowed, winding past old wooden buildings, some leaning, others freshly repaired, until they reached a modest structure set slightly apart from the town center. A small, functional cabin, sturdy and practical, with the faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the air. He opened the door with a fluid motion and stepped aside, allowing her to enter first. Inside, the room was sparse, an unmade bed, a rough-hewn table, and a single chair. But to her it seemed a haven, a refuge from both the sun and the world outside. She glanced at him, noting the subtle shift in his demeanor. The commanding, fearless figure who had faced a bandit without hesitation was now careful, considerate. He watched her with an intensity that made her both nervous and aware of an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. "You may rest here," he said, his voice calm but edged with authority. "No one will disturb you tonight." She nodded, her hands twisting nervously at the hem of her dress. The closeness of the space made it impossible to maintain the polite distance she normally upheld. She felt the heat of his presence, the subtle scent of leather, earth, and something distinctly him, mingling with the dust and warmth of the room. Every movement, every glance carried weight, an unspoken understanding that this moment was delicate, charged, and fraught with possibilities. Minutes stretched into silence, but the quiet was not uncomfortable. She felt him watching her, not intrusively, but with a steady awareness that made her heart beat faster than it had since the dress fell in the street. She wanted to speak, to break the tension, yet the words faltered on her lips. "Do you often travel alone?" he asked finally, his tone soft, probing, yet commanding respect. "Yes," she admitted, her voice quieter than before. I have had no choice. I am used to relying on myself." His eyes softened slightly, as though he recognized the courage required to survive in her world, and the even greater courage required to survive in his. "Independence is admirable," he said, "but even the strongest must sometimes accept help." Her gaze dropped to the floor, the weight of his words pressing gently against her pride. She had lived by self-reliance, yet the thought of surrendering control, even for safety, sent a thrill through her. There was something intoxicating about the way he offered protection without demanding obedience. His authority was natural, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. Hours passed as the sun set completely, leaving the cabin bathed in soft twilight. She moved to straighten the small bed, and he helped without hesitation, the closeness of their bodies unavoidable. Every accidental brush of fingers, every shared glance seemed magnified in the intimacy of the small space. Finally, she settled on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. He leaned against the doorway, watching her, silent yet fully present. The tension between them had shifted, not gone, but transformed into something deeper, more dangerous. There was curiosity, desire, and a fragile trust beginning to take root. "You are different from anyone I have ever met," he said quietly. "Not in the way you think. There is honesty about you, a willingness to face what others fear." She looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. "And you? You are unlike anyone I have ever known." In that small room, with shadows deepening and the world beyond the walls fading, the distance between them disappeared. They were no longer merely strangers bound by circumstance. They were two souls forced together, navigating the tension of survival, desire, and the unspoken promise of something neither fully understood. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder what it might feel like to truly trust him, not just with her safety, but with her heart. The night had settled over the town like a soft, dark blanket. The cabin was quiet now, lit only by the warm, flickering glow of a single lantern on the rough-hewn table. Outside, the wind whispered through the streets, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. Inside, the air was heavy with unspoken words, the kind that linger long after a shared glance. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped together, her thoughts tangled between fear, curiosity, and something far deeper she dared not name. The Apache leaned against the doorway, his figure partially shadowed, yet the faint glow from the lantern outlined the sharp angles of his face. The room felt impossibly small, the space between them charged with tension that neither had fully acknowledged. "I have never trusted easily," he said at last, his voice low, measured, yet carrying a weight that made her pause. "The world has taught me that trust is earned through blood, danger, and proof of strength. Few people ever reach that point." Her heart quickened. There was a vulnerability in his words, a crack in the armor he carried so naturally. For the first time, she glimpsed not just the fierce protector, but the man who had been shaped by hardship, survival, and solitude. "I understand," she replied softly. "I too have had to rely only on myself. It is exhausting, sometimes lonely." He took a careful step forward, the lantern casting shadows across his strong features. "I was not always like this," he admitted. "I had a family once. A home, a place where I could have been safe. But the world does not care for softness." His voice faltered slightly, but only for a heartbeat, before regaining its steady cadence. "I have learned to survive by strength, by caution, and by respecting the land above all else, and yet I am tired of walking alone." Her chest tightened, a mixture of empathy and an unexpected longing. She had always believed her hardships were hers alone, yet hearing his words illuminated a shared pain, one that transcended culture, upbringing, and circumstance. "I can understand that too," she whispered. "I have traveled far, seen danger I never imagined, and yet I have survived. I thought I would always be alone too." He studied her for a long moment, eyes dark and searching. "There is honesty in you," he said finally, almost as if speaking to himself. "And courage, far more than I expected. You are not afraid to face what others run from. That is why I cannot simply leave you to walk alone." She swallowed hard, feeling a shiver of warmth and something more, something primal, a stirring of the heart she had tried to guard. "I never imagined someone like you could understand me or accept me." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the intensity of the connection forming in the dimly lit room. He stepped closer, the space between them charged with the unspoken, The almost touch, the promise of intimacy. I do not know what the future holds, he admitted, voice husky, each word deliberate. But I know that since the moment I saw you, I have felt something I cannot ignore. You have changed something in me. Something I thought long dead. Her breath caught. She had felt it too. The pull, the spark, the tension that had begun the moment her dress had fallen into the dust. Now in the quiet, surrounded by shadows and warmth, it became undeniable. Her chest rose and fell with anticipation, her heart beating not just with fear or excitement, but with a tentative hope. I feel it too, she whispered, almost afraid to break the fragile spell of confession. I do not know what it means yet, but I trust you. He paused, absorbing her words like a lifeline thrown across the chasm of solitude they had both known. Then slowly he reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, careful, deliberate, yet it sent an electric shiver through her. Then we will face it together, he said quietly. Whatever comes, we will face it. Together. And in that small, dimly lit cabin, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and dust, the walls between them began to crumble. The confessions had been spoken, the trust tentatively given, and something delicate yet unbreakable began to take root. An intimacy forged not only from desire but from understanding, shared hardship, and the courage to reveal one's soul. For the first time since her journey began, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she had found someone who could see her completely and accept her entirely. The following morning, the sun rose over the frontier town in a wash of pale gold, illuminating every dusty corner and crooked boardwalk. Life in the streets resumed its familiar rhythm, traders hawking goods, horses stamping in their stalls, and townsfolk gossiping in low murmurs. But beneath the ordinary bustle, a subtle tension had begun to pulse. Eyes lingered a little too long on her when she walked, and whispers followed in her wake. She could feel it immediately. Even as she moved through the market to fetch necessities, glances lingered on her form, on the dress that still bore the faint dust of yesterday, and on the Apache who had become her silent companion. The townspeople were not overtly hostile, but their curiosity carried a sharp edge, like a blade hidden beneath a velvet cloth. Their murmurs hinted at disapproval, scandal, and speculation, a reminder that appearances mattered here, more than survival or honesty. They talked too much, she whispered to him as they walked side by side. Her voice was a mixture of frustration and unease. Every step we take, someone watches. He glanced at her, his dark eyes calm, unreadable, but filled with understanding. Let them, he said simply. They speak, they judge, they assume. None of it matters unless we allow it to. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of gossip had its own power. A small crowd had gathered near the general store when they passed, whispers spreading like wildfire through the dusty street. Isn't that the Apache who... And the woman? Who is she? Do you think they... The fragments of sentences carried judgment, curiosity, and fear in equal measure. One of the townsfolk, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl etched across his face, stepped forward, blocking their path. I've seen you with him, he said, his voice rough and deliberate. This town doesn't take kindly to outsiders, especially women mingling with strangers like him. She swallowed, clutching her basket of supplies a little tighter, unsure how to respond. The Apache, however, did not move. He stepped forward slightly, his presence commanding yet calm, his eyes fixed on the man with a quiet intensity that made even her uneasy companion falter. Outsider or not, he said, his voice low but unwavering, she walks these streets as she chooses. No one here has the right to dictate her actions or mine. The man grunted, shifting his weight. We speak for the town. We don't like improper pairings. The Apache's gaze didn't waver. Improper? You think freedom, courage, and honesty are improper? You judge without understanding. You assume without proof. Leave or face the consequences of your ignorance. For a tense moment, silence stretched as if the town itself held its breath. Then, grudgingly, the man stepped aside, muttering under his breath, and the crowd slowly dispersed. Yet their murmurs persisted, shadows of doubt and gossip following her like a persistent wind. She turned to him, eyes wide. You didn't have to confront them like that. His jaw tightened slightly, a shadow of something private crossing his face. I did, he said simply. You are under my protection. That is the way of things. And if I do not stand now, I will never forgive myself for allowing harm to come to you. Through fear, ignorance, or malice. A warmth spread through her chest at his words, not just gratitude, but a deeper, more intimate recognition of care. He had risked social confrontation, possibly danger to assert his stance, to defend her presence and right to exist freely, and in doing so, he revealed more than just physical protection. He revealed his heart. The day continued, but she noticed the glances, the whispered words, and the occasional frown directed at them. Yet with each encounter, she felt the growing realization that their bond was no longer private. It existed in the open now, exposed to the scrutiny of a world unprepared to understand it, and yet stronger for it. She glanced at him, the sun catching the sharp lines of his face, and a quiet certainty settled over her. The world could judge, could whisper, could attempt to drive them apart, but they had already proven that together, they could withstand far more than gossip or suspicion, and in that recognition a new strength took root in her. Love, or something that dared to be called that, would not simply survive. It would endure. The sun had disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the frontier town bathed in the soft silver light of the rising moon. The streets were quiet now, emptied of the daily bustle and lingering gossip. The only sounds were the distant murmur of the wind and the occasional creak of a wooden sign swaying on its hinges. Inside the cabin, a small fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. She sat near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm tea. The day's events, the confrontation in the street, the whispers, the constant awareness of watchful eyes, had left her exhausted, both physically and emotionally. But there was also a strange exhilaration simmering beneath her fatigue, a pull toward the man who had become the center of her world in just a few short days. He was seated across from her, leaning against the wall with one leg drawn up, eyes trained on the fire. The flickering light highlighted the rugged strength of his features, the sharp line of his jaw, the shadow of a scar on his cheek, the dark intensity in his eyes. He was silent, but the weight of his gaze was comforting rather than oppressive, a reminder of his presence, his strength, and the protective energy that had defined their time together. She felt a sudden boldness, a desire to bridge the distance that had always existed between them, however thin it might be. "Do you ever allow yourself to rest?" she asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I mean truly rest without worry?" He tilted his head, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then slowly a faint smile curved his lips. "I rarely do," he admitted, his voice low and deliberate. "There is always danger, always vigilance. To rest completely is a luxury, and yet, in your presence I feel it is possible, if only for a moment." Her heart fluttered at the words, a rush of warmth flooding her chest. She moved a step closer, settling on the floor near him. The firelight played across her features, casting her face in golden highlights and soft shadows. She dared to glance up at him, meeting his gaze, and found in it something unexpected. Openness, vulnerability, and a quiet invitation. "I feel the same," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I've spent so long guarding myself, keeping everyone at a distance. But with you, I feel like I can breathe." He studied her, eyes dark and searching, as though memorizing every detail, every flicker of emotion. Then, with careful deliberation, he reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. His touch was gentle, reverent even, and a shiver ran down her spine at the intimacy of the gesture. "You are brave," he said quietly, "braver than most who walk these lands. And yet, you are not afraid to be vulnerable. That is what draws me to you." She swallowed hard, aware of the pounding of her heart, the heat rising to her cheeks. "I've never allowed myself to be seen like this," she admitted. "I thought vulnerability was weakness, but now I see it as strength, and I see you." For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths and feelings too intense for words alone. The crackle of the fire seemed to echo the pulse of their shared anticipation. Then slowly he leaned closer, his presence enveloping her, his eyes never leaving hers. She felt the pull of gravity, the subtle tension of proximity, and allowed herself to surrender, if only partially, to the intensity of the connection. Their hands brushed tentatively at first, and then, without hesitation, they intertwined. The gesture was small, simple, but it carried an unspoken promise, trust, desire, and the acknowledgement of something far deeper than either had yet named. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the quiet assurance that she was safe, not just physically but emotionally, in a way that terrified and thrilled her all at once. He spoke then, his voice a low murmur that seemed to echo from the fire itself. Whatever comes, whatever the world may say, know that you are not alone, not while I stand here. Her eyes opened, meeting his once more, and she allowed herself to believe it, to trust it. And in that small, flickering room, surrounded by shadows, warmth, and the unrelenting pull between them, the walls they had both built around their hearts began to crumble. It was more than desire, more than fascination. It was the fragile, luminous beginning of something neither could deny. A connection forged in fire, trust, and the shared willingness to reveal their most vulnerable selves. The tranquility of the frontier night was shattered by the distant echo of hooves pounding against the hard-packed earth. She awoke to the sound, her pulse spiking instantly. The fire had died down to glowing embers, leaving the cabin cloaked in shadows. Outside, the wind carried the distinct rhythm of multiple riders approaching. Danger, swift and unmistakable. He was already on his feet before she could fully comprehend the threat, his movements precise and deliberate. The Apache's eyes were sharp, scanning the darkness beyond the cabin door. He pulled his knife from his belt and she could see the tension in his body, coiled like a spring ready to strike. "They've found us," he murmured, his voice calm but edged with urgency. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say." Her heart raced, but she trusted him implicitly. The day's lessons, the confrontation in town, the whispered confessions, the moments of vulnerability, had all built toward this. She had never felt so aware of another person's presence, of another's ability to protect, guide, and respond. She nodded, gripping the edge of the bed as he moved toward the door. Outside, the intruders were revealed. A gang of bandits, notorious for raiding travelers and small settlements. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cruel smile, spurred his horse forward, signaling the others. They were armed, confident, and dangerous, predators on familiar terrain. The Apache stepped onto the porch, his figure silhouetted against the moonlight. "This ends now," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "Leave or you will regret it." The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "We don't fear you or anyone else in this forsaken town. Step aside, boy, or we make you regret it." Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with anticipation. Her chest tightened, fear battling the strange thrill coursing through her veins. And then, in a controlled, fluid motion, the Apache moved. He disarmed one of the bandits in a single swift motion, redirecting the momentum of the attack and sending the man sprawling. Another charged, but he was met with precise strikes, his movements honed from years of survival in unforgiving lands. She watched, breath caught in her throat, as he faced each threat with a terrifying grace. The bandits faltered under his skill, their confidence crumbling like brittle wood against a hammer. Yet his attention never wavered from her. Even amid the chaos, he made certain she was safe, keeping her shielded from harm while neutralizing the threat with an economy of motion that spoke volumes of experience and restraint. Finally, the leader lunged forward, desperation fueling his attack. The Apache met him head-on, parrying with skill and striking with precision. The fight was over in moments, swift, decisive, and unrelenting. The bandits scattered into the night, defeated not just by strength, but by the unyielding presence of a man who refused to let harm touch the woman he had chosen to protect. She emerged from the cabin steps, her dress fluttering in the cool night breeze, her hands trembling. He turned toward her, chest rising and falling with exertion, eyes dark and unreadable, yet softened by relief. "Are you unharmed?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. "Yes," she whispered, breathless, the adrenaline still surging through her. "Thanks to you." He stepped closer, closing the distance, and for the first time, she saw the full measure of the man before her. Not just the warrior, not just the protector, but the heart beneath the armor. "You must understand," he said quietly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, "that the world may challenge us, try to break us apart. But tonight we proved that together we are stronger than fear, stronger than danger." Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but a deep, unshakable certainty settled over her. The bond they had formed through whispers, confessions, vulnerability, and trust had been tested and had endured. She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. Together, she echoed, the single word carrying the weight of promised desire and newfound strength. The night stretched on, moonlight spilling across the dusty town, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. The world might whisper, threaten, or try to pull them apart, but the fire between them had been ignited, and nothing could extinguish it. The first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, soft and golden, casting the dusty town in a gentle glow. The streets, once filled with whispers and wary glances, were quiet now, as if the night's events had swept away the tension that had lingered like a stubborn shadow. She walked beside him, her hand lightly brushing against his, feeling the steady warmth of his presence with every step. The townsfolk, who had watched them with suspicion and curiosity, now regarded them with a cautious respect. Gossip still lingered, of course, but it had lost its edge. They had seen the bond, the courage, and the loyalty that defined this union, and though some may never have fully understood it, the whispers carried acknowledgement. These two had endured the frontier together and had emerged stronger for it. She glanced at him, taking in the rugged strength of his features, the quiet intensity in his dark eyes, and the way his jaw relaxed in rare moments of peace. The man who had once appeared as a shadow of the wilderness now stood as her protector, companion, and, she allowed herself to admit, her heart. "You've changed everything for me," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the gentle morning breeze. "I never thought I could feel this way in a place like this." He turned to her, his gaze steady and unwavering. "And you have changed me," he admitted, his voice low, deliberate. "I have lived by rules written in the dust and the land, by survival and solitude. But you have shown me that there is more, that life is more than endurance, that love can be found even here." For a moment neither spoke. The world around them faded, the soft creak of the boardwalks, the distant lowing of cattle. Even the pale light of the rising sun seemed to shrink away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet, fragile space between day and possibility. She laughed softly, a sound of relief and joy mingled, as if the weight of every danger, every obstacle, every whispered doubt had lifted. "I suppose that means there's no turning back," she said. "Not for either of us." His lips curved into the faintest smile, a rare and gentle expression that softened the intensity of his features. "No turning back," he agreed. "Not when we have found this connection, this trust." They moved closer, drawn together by an invisible force that had guided them through dust, danger, and doubt. When their hands finally entwined fully, it was not a hesitant gesture, but a deliberate affirmation, a promise of partnership, of shared strength, of hearts surrendered to one another. Her dress, once stained with dust and vulnerability, now seemed to symbolize more than her journey. It symbolized survival, resilience, and the triumph of trust. As the morning breeze caught it, lifting it slightly around her legs, she allowed herself to smile, not with embarrassment, but with freedom and newfound confidence. He took her hand in both of his, guiding her toward the edge of town, toward the horizon beyond the dusty streets. "We face whatever comes together," he said, his voice carrying both certainty and warmth. "No fear, no doubt, just the two of us." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, not of sorrow but of joy. She nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of completion and hope. "Together," she echoed, the word resonating like a sacred vow. And in that moment, as the sun rose higher, illuminating the frontier town in warm light, they stepped forward, side by side, unafraid, united. The trials of the past days, the dangers of the wilderness, and the skepticism of the world could no longer touch them. Their bond was forged in dust, danger, confession, and trust, and it was unbreakable. As they walked, the town slowly came to life around them, the whispers now replaced with quiet admiration and acknowledgement. They had not just survived the frontier, they had claimed it as their own together. The Apache turned to her, a rare softness in his eyes, and she met it with a smile that spoke of love, gratitude, and promise. In the vast, untamed land, where the wind carried dust and danger alike, they had found one certainty, each other, and so, hand in hand, hearts intertwined, they walked forward into the rising sun. leaving the past behind and stepping into a future that was theirs alone, a life of trust, passion, and love, unshaken by the trials they had faced and strengthened by the journey that had brought them together.